Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt, Deputy Leader of the Social Democratic Party.
And I'm Sebastian Moore, a member of the Young Social Democrats.
Now, it feels like really old news, but this is our first podcast since we've known the outcome of the US election. And I know, Sebastian, that everybody will want to ask the question, when did you go to bed?
9 o'clock in the morning.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was exciting though, I can tell you. And it flew by. So we started watching it, my housemate and I, at about 10 p.m, which is when you start getting the initial commentary. And we would have been watching it for 11 hours straight. And you wouldn't do that in the daytime, but at night it just seems fine. We had lots of tea and coffee and beers and cake and all sorts.
And you weren't confident before 9 o'clock? You stayed up until you were confident, or...?
I don't know. There's never a point you can really switch off. And I think that's different to the UK election, because in the UK you kind of have all of the results at some point. Whereas the US, I mean, we're at, 7-8 days after the election, and we still don't know the full results, which is just absurd. 95% reporting at the moment, but California, they're on 80% reporting. So I just think it's unbelievable how they can't manage to tally up all the votes.
You'd think Musk would have his eye on doing this more efficiently next time, wouldn't you? Anyway, we're going to talk about that in a minute when we do our news items. And I know, Sebastian, you also want to talk a bit about UK crime. So that'll be our news section. Then we'll be talking to SDP member Dr. Shaun Long in our Bring Me Solutions section about an issue that's been in the news quite a bit since the budget, farming. And then in Culture Club, we're going to do some book and film reviews. So let's go back then to the US election. I want to talk in particular about Trump's attitude to tariffs. As we know, he loves tariffs. But did you want to just mention a few more general points first?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak too much about this, because I'm sure everyone will know that every person, every commentator, every pundit, journalist is dissecting this, and everybody's got their own post-mortem on why Trump won and why the Democrats lost. I would like to add a few things, just certain things I've noticed. So firstly, I think this is very different to 2016. And if you think about who Trump is and who he was in 2016 as this complete political outsider, he's now had 4 years as president. And I think a lot of the media's attacks on him as this unhinged madman that shouldn't be given access to the nuclear codes, etc., I think a lot of that is just bypassing people now. I don't think people are listening to these media attacks.
That whole Trump derangement syndrome seems to have died away, doesn't it? Yeah,
it does. And, one thing I'd say is, like, after all these media attacks, and you think of how, we said this last week, that he's probably the most famous person in the world. If he is that bad, how bad they say he is, and if all of their, I would call it propaganda, but let's say analysis of Trump over this past 8 years, if that is true, then how bad must your side be to have lost to this man? I think that really requires some self-reflection, because 75 million people so far, there will be more when the votes are fully tallied up, but 75 million people voted for him. And he won the popular vote. It is close in terms of percentages. He's 50.4% to Harris's 48.2%. But as far as this election could have been one-sided, it was one-sided. Like, there is a very clear winner. He's won the Electoral College by a huge amount. So I think the Democrats really have to ask themselves what is going on their side for people to be completely rejecting them.
And how about the reaction in the UK? So I know you're a big fan of Rory Stewart, aren't you? Were you surprised by his reaction?
I do like Rory Stewart. I have a lot of problems with Rory Stewart and what he says, but
he's a fanboy. Sebastian is a fanboy.
No, but I do like him, and I've read a couple of his books. I think they missed something for sure. I mean, I went to the Rest Politics Live thing. Did I tell you about this?
You did, yes.
And the 4 people on stage, Rory Stewart, Alistair Campbell, Catty Kay and Anthony Scaramucci, they're all massively anti-Trump. And they said they're very concerned because they don't think that Americans will be able to vote for a black woman. And they were really worried that Trump would win because of that. And I think that just shows me that they just miss the bigger picture here.
Absolutely.
I just want to add one other thing. I know we're keen to talk about tariffs as well, but I think this is it's quite a seismic shift in politics, certainly in America, but I think, what happens in America, kind of we see the brunt of that later on. And the left in America has shifted massively. You would have thought they would have woken up in 2016 and thought, okay, why have people voted this way? And I just don't think they've answered those questions properly. And the Democrats has somehow become the party of big money, corporate mega donors. I mean, do you know how much Harris raised? How much money?
I think it was 3 times as much as Trump. I don't know what the number is.
Over $1 billion. It's the first time that a candidate has raised over $1 billion, which, I mean, to put that into perspective, that is more than the GDP of 10 countries in the world. There are 10 countries with a GDP of less than $1 billion. So it's now the party, weirdly, of people like Dick Cheney and the neocons, Mark Cuban, people that would have been Republicans 20 years ago, and the left just seems to have kind of sold itself out. But one thing I'll just add as a kind of caveat, which is they conceded the election. I haven't seen anybody saying it was anything otherwise, and that's a really, really good thing, because I think a lot of us were worried that this would lead to many problems. And the fact that they've said, yeah, he won fair and square, is a message that that's how you lose an election. And I think Trump did not lose well last time.
No, that loser's consent is a key part of our democracy, isn't it? So I agree with you. It's good that it hasn't ended up in wranglings in court or lawfare or any of those things. So do you mind if I move on to tariffs?
Let's go for it.
Because that is a kind of key part of Trump's overall manifesto. I know we don't yet know the absolute detail of what he will do, but in broad terms, he's signposted a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. Remember, there is already a 50% tariff on Chinese cars being imported into America, and a 10% tariff on goods from other countries. So, there's a real discussion and debate and almost a bit of a panic, I think, in the media about this, about tariffs being a disaster. And certainly for the kind of free marketeers of the kind of globalist elites that we've been, used to setting the agenda for us, this does seem to be a really key worry for them. So I did think it was worth talking about it a little bit from the point of view of, is it a disaster? Is this a real problem? And the first point I think is really important that we think about is that I would argue very strongly that tariffs are only ever a secondary issue. The really important thing for any country is to kind of make good stuff that people want. So, if you think about when Apple iPhones were the only game in town, if they'd cost an extra 10%, would we have all said, oh, it's okay, we don't want them anymore? We wanted them almost whatever the price. And I think to that extent, price is actually quite elastic. People are willing to pay a higher price for something that it meets their needs, which, might be very high quality, or it might be very innovative, something that, really moves your expectations on. And so that the whole discussion about tariffs almost assumes that everybody can make the same thing, and it's just about price.
And these tariffs, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the tariffs are, especially as Trump comes out and says, China are going to pay for this, China are going to pay for that. The tariff is, if I understand it right, is effectively just an import tax.
It is, exactly that, yes. Yeah, and as I say, they do already apply quite high tariffs to some Chinese goods coming in. And I think if you kind of move it on in terms of what does that mean for other countries, because whilst a lot of the debate has focused on the US and China, I think I would argue that having, you might almost call it grit in the system, having grit in the system in the form of some form of import tax or tariff does kind of help economies to grow the pearl, to be more innovative, not just for the home market, but for international markets as well. So If you think about it, if the US is charging China a big import tax and China is charging the USA a big import tax, that means British goods, for example, will be much more attractive than US goods in China. So it's a real opportunity. And in the UK, I think our discussion around this should be, what does this changed international position mean for us? How can we really benefit from it? What are our real opportunities here? And the surprising thing is that it's almost exactly the opposite that we're seeing. So if you think about some of the discussion about from people like Liam Byrne, kind of senior Labour politician, he's, running round being really concerned about it. I know that Rachel Reeves is doing a Mansion House speech on Thursday, and she's expected to argue against it there.
Liam Byrne's the one that left the note after 2010 saying there's no money left.
That's the one. That's exactly the one. I think that's the thing is almost most known for, isn't it? I'm sure he's quite unimpressed by that, but I think that is the reason everybody knows his name. So, I say we should be thinking about this in a really upbeat and optimistic way. But for those who are comfortable with the current globalist regime, the kind of anti-populists, which, I would put Labour in that box, to be honest, for those, they actually don't like nation states to be able to wield national power. They much prefer the kind of global rules-based system that they might call it. So for them, the fact that there's a pushback against kowtowing to those supranational organisations, I think is really alarming to them, and they really don't know how to react. They're saying it's very, very unwelcome, and on one level, I think it's right to say that it will almost certainly mean an increase in international tensions. But I think this is me. This is not a scholastic comment. This is kind of my instinct. My instinct is that when things like these discussions come up, they kind of indicate the fact that there's a shift in power relations. So I think if you think about back to the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1840s, that repeal movement was led by that kind of new class of merchants and entrepreneurs, along with ordinary working people, who were trying to push back against the old landed aristocracy. For the old landed aristocracy, high food prices were great because that increased the amount that they made. And to challenge that power of the old aristocrats was a real game changer. And so I do think that all these discussions about tariffs and international trade are actually a symptom that the tectonic plates of power relations are moving. And I think that's a good thing, because I think we've been caught in this stasis, haven't we, effectively since the fall of the Berlin Wall, where there was this idea that there is no alternative to the market, that, the world as it is the world as it must be. And opening up discussions about how the world might be, I think is good for us, good for social democracy, and good for those who do want to see changes in the world.
Firstly, I want to say that's hopefully not the last time that the Corn Laws are going to be mentioned on this podcast.
I think I'm very proud to make sure that we can mention these local
I'm sure you've just given people trauma of their history class at school. But some might argue and say, well, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the people that were in favour of repealing the Corn Laws were in favour of free trade. And so that power shift was one from protectionism towards free trade. And that movement from a protectionist that benefited the aristocracy and the super rich towards a free trade economy was one that was good and we should sort of strive for. Are you saying that there's an argument to say we've gone too far one way and this free trade doesn't benefit everybody?
I think that if you look at this as a mathematical issue and you look at people having different levels at which they can produce different goods, it's incontrovertible to say that free trade on that basis is good for everybody. But what that ignores is political power and political structures. And, at the end of the day, much as we might both like mathematics, maths is not the only answer to problems. And we need to be really conscious that it's a bit like, when we were talking about COVID, there was always this argument that we'll do what the science says. And actually, whilst the science can tell you something, the science is important, science doesn't tell you the answer. It tells you the options. And making a decision amongst those options is a political choice.
Can you give me an example of an area where we might want more protectionism?
So I think if you just think about that in very basic terms, if you think about where might we as a country not want to be 100% reliant on another country, you might come up with a list quite quickly. You might say food. We perhaps want to have more self-sufficiency in food. And I'm not saying that we have to grow every single thing and we can't import anything, but we need to think about our food security. Perhaps even more so than that, energy. And I think we saw during COVID and during the Ukraine war that when it was more difficult to transport things around the world, we suddenly started thinking about where these things come from. Steel is perhaps another one that's been in the news recently. Are we really comfortable with the fact that we can no longer process virgin steel? That feels to me putting a lot of trust in international trade that might not always be something that we can rely on. Arms, do we want to just rely on other people to make arms for us?
And so we might put import taxes, tariffs on these goods, let's say food, for example, as a sort of basic need. What might happen then if we put an import tariff on certain food coming in, let's say lamb from, Argentina? What might happen? How would that affect farmers in the UK?
So I'm sure Dr. Shaun Long knows much more about this, and he's going to be on the podcast a bit later. But I would say what that does is to make those imported goods more expensive, which perhaps makes it easier for local farmers to compete against those alternatives. Or it might make us just say, well, do you know what, rather than have lamb this week, I'll have steak and have, a UK steak rather than an imported lamb. So I think it does those kind of things. But the other thing it also does is to make us think about how we get from, farm to shop. What are the innovations that would make farming more efficient? And again, I think all those things are really welcome things.
Awesome. Shall we talk about crime?
I know that's been very much on your mind in a personal as well as a political capacity, hasn't it?
Yeah, so as you know, 2 of my friends had their bikes stolen very recently, within a week of each other. And it's something that, living in Manchester, especially I live in the city centre, you see a lot of bikes missing wheels that are locked up where the wheels have been stolen, or wheels that are locked up where the frame's been stolen. And everybody I know that cycles has had an experience of bike theft. And it's an issue that is in the news as well, because there have been articles about people that have had to take it into their own hands to track down their bikes. And there's ingenious ways of doing this. There was one article on the BBC which described a man that sort of organised a sting operation because he found his bike on Gumtree, and he got in touch with the police and said, look, I know you haven't wanted to look into this, but I've managed to find the bike. Can you come with me? And they actually went with him to find the bike. Now, not everybody's as lucky as him, because the police are unwilling to investigate. And actually, when I phoned in and made a report on my friend's bike who was stolen at the time, she was devastated about this. So I phoned up and said, like to make a report about this bike that's been stolen. And they said, we sort of went through the details, and it was they're almost surprised that we're ringing this in. They're like, yeah, really? You want to report this? It was like that sort of tone. And he explained to us at the end of the phone call, okay, this is going to be a closed case. because we don't have the resources to investigate it. And I said, what do you mean a closed case? And he says, well, we won't do anything about it now. We've closed the case. If you have any other evidence, then do come back to us and maybe we can reopen it. And we even had the serial number of the bike. There were CCTV cameras around where it had been stolen. And they said, well, if you can get the footage to us, we'll look at it.
And that's your job, not the police's job.
And the problem with that is that we spoke to the 3 different building companies that had the CCTV, and they said, we can't show you the CCTV. You'll have to get the police to come down and look at it. And of course they won't. Now, what really upset my friend after all this is that the person that we made this report to then had the gall to say, can I ask you a few questions about your identity and what's your ethnicity? To which my friend said, I'm not going to tell you. I don't care. Like, that's not relevant. And I asked him, what relevance does this have? And he said, the Home Office make us ask these questions. So it's very, very frustrating because the police don't seem to be doing the sort of job that they used to do, which was investigate things like crime. There's obviously talk of this, of police not investigating any crime that's where the value of the theft was under £200. The details on that seem to be quite murky, but I think it's really, really important because when we lose sight of the real bread and butter issues, around petty theft in the community, I think that's the start of the breakdown of our society.
It is, and I was interested in your story about somebody trying to kind of take on the investigation themselves, because you do sometimes see it in supermarkets when people are shoplifting. Do occasionally see other shoppers saying, what are you doing with that? And trying to intervene. And it's quite interesting because the security guards in the supermarket, they presumably also have similar instructions that unless it's a really significant theft, they just let them go.
Yeah. I saw it the other day where somebody had stolen some stuff from the supermarket. The security guard came out and said, go on, give it back. And he gave it back and then the guy walked off. And it was really shocking to me. It might not be shocking for a lot of people, but to me, especially having grown up in a rural area where something like crime was taken a lot more seriously, it's shocking to see, people can just try it out. If it doesn't work, okay, I'll go on to the next shop. I've got a couple of stats. So that the percentage of reported bike thefts that resulted in a charge remains below 2%. And if you look at the number of bikes that are stolen, the stats on this are a little bit deceptive because it requires people to report the theft. Now, if police aren't doing anything about these reports, then people are going to stop reporting it. So there's actually more accurate data from something called the British Crime Survey, which has found that 300,000 bikes are stolen every year. So that's just under 1,000 bikes every single day are stolen. And obviously people will know this anecdotally. If you live somewhere like Manchester or in big cities, you'll know that there's no reason to have an expensive bike because it will just be a target for thieves.
So I guess the question is, what should we be doing about this? And I don't want to encourage everybody to go out and be vigilantes in their neighbourhood. But at the same time, it does feel to me that we have to start having a bit more of a kind of zero tolerance to this kind of, not just petty crime, but petty antisocial behaviour, I suppose you might call it. I'm one of those very annoying old women who tell children to take their feet off the seats on the bus. And who, when somebody drops litter in front of me, I pick it up and give it to them and say, I think you dropped this. And you quite often get a real mouthful of obscenities from people when you do that. But I do think that they perhaps won't do it next time. So to some extent, I think you've just got to be a bit thick-skinned and say, well, that's fine. But I do actually think they won't do it again. That kind of feels like a very small contribution. But is there something bigger we can do to kind of rebuild that civic pride and civic trust? So
I think that there's two contrasting opinions on this. And I think the prevailing wisdom amongst let's say the establishment politicians in the country is a top-down approach where they'll go off and they'll maybe do a task force at some point when it gets so serious, and they'll come up with certain ideas that probably won't work. And I think in a large way, and people will notice that, for example, Isle of Man has some of the lowest crime statistics anywhere in the world because they still have that high trust society in which community plays such a role. So, for example, I don't know my neighbours. So if someone's breaking into my house, they won't know necessarily that it's not the person that lives there. And
everybody knows everybody on the Isle of Man, I think.
Exactly. And, there's these sort of stories about people leaving their doors open because nobody would steal anything. But that's kind of the upbringing I had, growing up in rural Dorset. We would just leave the front door open. And there wasn't there wasn't this fear every time that you left your bike somewhere that was going to be stolen. I remember growing up and leaving my bike outside shops. I never locked it up. And so now, and this is the problem, if you take a path or a solution to this, which is we'll sort of create more protection for, we'll buy bike locks and we'll create structures where people, shelters where people can put their bikes, you're just going to be playing a losing game because you'll just keep going down that path and the crooks, the thieves will get more ingenious in the ways that they break these bikes out. And it's got to the point now where I'm thinking, right, I'm going to even have to lock up the back wheel as well as the front wheel and the frame. And I've got a very cheap bike. So you're spending more on the locks than you're even spending on the bikes.
You see some people with locks that are so chunky, they must weigh a ton. They must kind of double the amount of weight that you're carrying on the bike.
Right. And so for me, this is really important. People will say, we've got other important stuff to worry about. And I'd say there is nothing more important than this sort of thing. We start here. This is the stand you take, which is to say, no, we're not going to just accept the fact that loads of bikes get stolen. We want local police officers that know their community, and when something gets stolen and somebody gets found to have stolen it, there's a little bit of shame that's brought back to say, oi, what are you doing that for? And the community can rally behind that and bring back these sort of values that we had. And I'm sure a lot of places, listeners might be hearing this thinking, oh, my village, it's like that at the moment. Well, we need that all over the country, and I don't just see it as a downward trend, which is inevitable.
So rebuilding communities, got to be a key part of what we do.
Yes.
So in Bring Me Solutions this week, we talked to Dr. Shaun Long, SDP member, and we want to discuss with Shaun issues around farming. Farming's been in the news quite a bit recently. I think we're currently being threatened with the idea that Jeremy Clarkson might lead a farmers' revolt. So what's the issue? What are the problems? And what are some solutions? So, Shaun, do you want to give us a quick intro to yourself and then maybe tell us what the issues are?
Yes. Well, I must admit, I'm not a specialist in agriculture, really, but I live in the country. I grew up in the country, and I'm quite aware of a lot of the issues that farmers face. And I've got contacts with a couple of people in the locality.
And this is up in Cumbria, where you live?
It is, yes, up in the beautiful Eden Valley.
So what are some of the problems in the farming world? What are some of the problems facing farmers?
Right, well, one continual gripe is paperwork, uncertainty, unscrupulous supermarket practices. For example, one of our local farmers, he was a dairy farmer for many years, but by 2015 it had become completely unviable. And they later sort of moved into rearing beef using a traditional variety that's well suited to the locality, the belted Galloway. You've probably seen them, sort of big, banded, sort of shaggy panda type cows, but with a bit more energy. Back during COVID, his daughter happened to be down in London working in pharmaceuticals, and she set up this Instagram account about the farm, and it sort of caught on, and it started getting inquiries. Oh, can we buy your beef? How can we buy your beef? And they thought, oh, okay, let's try this out. Let's see if we can sell direct to the customer and sort of ship nationally. And it really took off, and it's become quite a success. And we certainly buy all of our beef directly from them. It's good price, it's high quality. The beef is produced in a sort of sustainable way, on regenerative principles. It's native hardy varieties grazing on typical grassland up here. So it's non-intensive. So it's a good product for a good price, and the farmer gets a good deal. because the supermarkets are cut out.
So this kind of links quite nicely to what we were talking about earlier with our tariffs and sort of caring about where things are made. And certainly, I'm in my 20s and I've lived many parts of the world, and I'm perhaps quite detached from what the things that I'm buying in the supermarket, where they're from, because it's not something that I think people of my generation are used to worrying about. Do you think this is something that the consumer has to put more of an effort into, knowing exactly where the goods have been produced and where the meat is coming from? Do you think it's something that consumer has to pay more attention to?
Well, I think consumers, generally speaking, do prefer if they can buy something produced in the country. Obviously, we're not going to be selling them British bananas or anything. But yeah, when it comes to things like beef and lamb, it's good to have an accurate provenance. But supermarkets are a bit, I don't know, they're a bit unscrupulous. I'm sure you'll both have heard about the fact that quite often you will see something that's labelled British, and there's some sort of get out clause which basically says if it's packaged in Britain, then it's British, even if it's imported from elsewhere.
And what are the other things? So you mentioned paperwork being an issue. You mentioned supermarkets being an issue. What are the other things that farmers are grumbling about?
The government, whichever government it is, like the weather, it's always there, but it changes. For example, in the Labour manifesto, they had a grand total of 87 words on farming, none of which really said anything. So that gave their direction of travel, really. We don't want to say what we're going to do. There's long hours, of course, for relatively small rewards. I don't think they believe that the potential of Brexit has been maximised. I think we certainly managed to produce a high-quality product in this country, which we could charge a premium for if we had the right export markets. Now, quite what's going to happen now with the political changes in the US, I don't know. Because I think any future trade deal that's struck between the UK and the US with Trump coming in it's got to be, he's going to want to see it as being a good deal for American farmers. And of course, the two countries have very different standards. So we'll have to see what happens there. I think personally, so long as the point of origin of different products is clearly signed in supermarkets and other outlets, then it could be up to the consumer to choose, where they purchase their produce from. So that might be a way around it, but I do realise that it leaves us rather vulnerable to cheaper imports of beef, for example, produced using different methods and possibly to a lower standard. So something else, which of course is tricky for younger people wanting to get into farming. Well, a couple of things really. How do they do it if they're not in a farming family already? If they'd like to try their hand at it, how can they practically train to become a farmer? We've lost a lot of our agricultural colleges in recent years, including Newton Rig in Penrith in the last few years. So we need to really look at what we can do to bring those colleges back, to revitalise them, and to give the farmers of the future the skills that they require, and give young people a different route in, and give them the chance perhaps to start out in a county farm, something that's owned by the council.
There was something else in the budget. Obviously, it was quite big news that the inheritance tax change, where there was an exemption for farms, and they've made a change to that. This has upset a lot of farmers, and I think there's even protests or planned protests about this. Yes,
19th of November, I believe. Although there was some confusion recently as to whether the Met were going to let it go ahead. Now, I don't know whether that was because they had a particular aversion to muck spreaders or some other reason. But yes, it's rumoured that Jeremy Clarkson will be leading a sort of farmers' revolt. next, Wednesday, it's the 19th. Is that Tuesday?
Next Tuesday.
So we'll have to see what happens. That could be quite interesting.
Can you just explain what this change is? Because a lot of people will hear this and think, well, why shouldn't farmers be paying inheritance tax just like everybody else?
Okay. There's a common misapprehension that farmers are wealthy. Now, they might be in terms of their assets, but they're usually asset rich but cash poor. So, for example, in the UK, the average farm size will be 82 hectares, so that's just over 202 acres. The value of that land alone can vary for rough pasture from about 3,850 an acre. So you're looking at a total of 315,000 for the land, up to, for the same amount of land for good arable, you're looking at a figure of 2.16 million. And that's excluding the house that you live in, the barns, the other agricultural buildings, your equipment. A new combine can cost up to around 300,000 and a new tractor $250,000. So these are very expensive assets. And then you've got the livestock, seed, etc. So there will be a very large number of farmers who will, those who inherit farms, discovering that they're going to be landed with a massive tax bill upon the death of the parent, and they won't be able to pay it because the actual turnover on the farms, or the more strictly speaking, the profit is often quite low, and it just will not cover 20% of the value of their assets. So, in other words, if they are compelled to sell them, if they're compelled to pay that, then they're going to have to sell up. It might result in the farm itself closing and them leaving farming altogether, which would not be good for either them or for the economy, or indeed for our national food security, because it will increase our dependence upon imports. Now, some have said that this might be linked, might be a bit of a sleight of hand on the part of the administration to try and have a bit of a land grab to put solar farms and wind farms on the land thus expropriated. And of course, the value of farmland will decline as well if farms come onto the market like that and there aren't sufficient buyers because, do you want to buy it if you cannot pass that asset on in its entirety? Some people will, a lot of people won't be able to. So, it's not good.
And this would negatively impact small family farms more so than a huge business. Yeah,
I mean, if you're a massive business with thousands of acres, then perhaps for a start, it will probably be registered as a company or a trust or something, rather than being a family farm. And it's been suggested by some people that a workaround might be for family farms to become trusts with directors, whatever, different members of the family. So if one of them dies, then the farm isn't taken away from the family. Because a family farm is essentially a sort of collaborative endeavour across the generations. It's not really owned by the eldest member. It's the whole family. It sort of gets passed down. There's that continuity, both of ownership and of knowledge and attachment to the land. So this is something that's very important to keep as well. If you lose those family farms, you lose all those generations of accumulated expertise.
I think it fits in with there's a lot of themes in this podcast today that are sort of tying together. But if you just look at purely the mathematical side of it, you might say, well, they're clearly not making enough profit if they're not able to pay the inheritance tax. And I think people have to ask themselves, do we want small family farms to exist? Is that something that the UK as a country wants to promote? And I think if you answer yes, you show that there is something more than just the pure maths and the pure numbers and the pure profit that is important to you.
Yes, I mean, well, as revealed in a sideways fashion by John McTernan the other day in his interview on GB News, where he he was saying that he was perfectly happy for family farmers to go the same way as the miners in the mining industry in the 80s under Thatcher, which I thought was an outrageous comment. There does seem to be an element on the part of some people in the Labour Party of sort of, I don't know, some misplaced class war kind of element there. Yeah, we don't need small family farms. We can just have large, massive conglomerates or whatever taking over the land. I don't think that's a good idea at all. Just like the soul was ripped out of those mining communities back in the 80s and indeed in the 90s when the closures were still undergoing, even under Labour, those places have never really properly recovered from it. Nothing has come in to replace that sense of community and the wealth that is a hard life in the mines, but they brought wealth to the areas in which they were situated. If you now do that to the countryside as well, you're tearing that social fabric apart as well. And it's like the whole of our country seems to be becoming ever more atomized, different parts of society torn apart by the forces of globalization. And this seems to be the latest sort of manifestation of it. And I think we need to resist that.
So finally, Shaun, just to kind of finish on perhaps a more optimistic note, we do like to be clear that there are some solutions to some of these problems. Do you want to just give us, some pointers as to where solutions might lie?
Some pointers. Well, for a start, I think that this 20% inheritance tax needs to be revoked. We need to put our agricultural sector at the forefront of life in the countryside again. We need to make it easier for people to be able to identify what is produced here and by whom, and emphasise the standards by which it is produced, compared to imports and so on. We need to make sure that our trade deals do not disadvantage our farmers, which could be quite tricky in negotiations with the new Trump administration. There may be a number of things which are energising and refreshing about it, but unfortunately it's going to be very hard-nosed on agriculture. And we need to stand up to that. We need also to ensure that we have affordable housing available in the countryside so that young people aren't forced out. It's so difficult. Well, it's the same all across the country. It's terrible in cities. It's terrible in the country. There just aren't enough places to live. So we need to build, not concrete the countryside over entirely, but we do need more affordable housing made available through local councils. We need some more social housing to help keep young people in our localities and ensure that they thrive in the future. And as I mentioned earlier, we also need to ensure that the training is there, which will enable them to be able to get into farming if that's a career path that they'd like to pursue. So they're just a few of the things I'd like to see us doing.
Can I finish with perhaps a more light-hearted question? Were you a fan of Clarkson's Farm at all?
I must admit, I've not seen it yet. It's on. Is it on Netflix or something?
I watched it on Amazon. Amazon Prime. I watched it on. And I think it's the first time many of us have had any inkling of what farming life is like. Although I think some of us are just a little bit wary of thinking that everything that Jeremy Clarkson says is true. But certainly some of the things like, the need to work through the night to bring the harvest home, as it were.
Yes.
I think we'd kind of imagined those things didn't happen anymore, and it seems that they do. Yes. Seems that, many farmers do get very emotionally and engaged with their animals, even though we kind of tend to think that they don't. So, I think for many of us townies, it's the first time we'd kind of really had an insight into farming life. So I would certainly recommend that you watch it.
Well,
thank you.
I grew up on a small farm, and just before we started recording, I said, it wasn't a proper farm. And now as we're talking about this, I think, well, my mum, she sold eggs that the chickens and the geese produced. She sold horse manure, a huge seller. You wouldn't believe it. And we harvested hay as well. So one of the best days of the year on the farm that I grew up on was when we would get the hay in. And it was just such a good day from dawn to dusk. And then we'd always have a barbecue and have some drinks in the evening. And it was just a brilliant sort of, it was engaging with nature in such a way. It was brilliant fun.
So that anyway brings us along to Culture Club. So this is our final section of the podcast where we talk about a couple of things that are more related to the cultural sphere, so books or films or podcasts or anything else that we've been listening to. And I was really surprised, Sebastian, when you told me what you were bringing to Culture Club this week. So what is it?
So at the weekend, I watched a film called Lagaan, which is a Bollywood film. So a close friend of mine who's Indian, she has introduced me to this wonder, which is Bollywood. Have you seen any Bollywood, Shaun?
I must admit I haven't. My sister likes it, though. Yeah, she's watched a few.
It's a whole world that opens up to you, honestly. So the film Lagaan, Hilary, you'll love this. Lagaan means tax in Hindi. Or a similar word to tax, yeah. So it doesn't have the most exciting title in the world. But it was released in 2001. It stars Aamir Khan, who's one of the sort of the lead Bollywood stars, and it was set during the British Raj, so in 1893. And it's about a farmer named Bhuvan who accepts the challenge of the local, the British Army captain. And the challenge is that if the villagers win a game of cricket against the British Army officers, they will not have to pay taxes, Lagaan, for 3 years. But if they lose, there will be triple Lagaan. So it's a game of cricket, basically, the whole film.
High stakes game.
High stakes. And I know you're a big fan of cricket, so
am.
You'll love this. It's a film about cricket that's called Tax. This is right up your street, Hilary.
Absolutely, in my area, definitely.
So for anybody that doesn't know much about Bollywood, I've certainly had no experience of it. It's really about escapism. So India, obviously nowadays it's developing and it's a bigger economy than the UK, but has often been in the past a very poor country. And Bollywood is a very larger than life, over the top, very exaggerated cinema. And people would go there to escape the sort of daily lives and just watch the bright colours, the songs, the dances, the huge sort of storylines. And it's really funny watching it as somebody that grew up maybe on British films or on Hollywood, in that it's so different. So this Lagaan film, I'm going to put people off now, it's 3 hours and 44 minutes. And it is just like a marathon where you just... You get to see so much more detail about the characters, and then there'll be 10-minute songs in between.
To be fair, if it's a cricket match, it could have been 5 days.
Right. And we said it's great because the cricket match itself forms such a big part of the film, and it really feels like a cricket match that's just going on forever. So I really, really enjoyed it, and it is a very much, it paints the British as a caricature, the sort of the evil British who are sort of smirking and cackling as they're extorting these huge taxes from the poor villagers. But having said that, it's really interesting to see a film that's set in that time and from the perspective of the Indians that made the film in the early 21st century.
Sounds great. And where can I watch this?
That's a good question. We watched it on YouTube, actually. There was a link on YouTube. Yeah. But I'm a huge fan of Shah Rukh Khan, who's the sort of the biggest Bollywood star. You probably recognise him. He's the face of Bollywood. And he's my hero, Shah Rukh Khan.
He's replaced Rory Stewart then?
Yeah. I'm not sure Rory Stewart was ever my hero, but there we go.
Right. Okay.
Oh no, I'm going to develop a reputation.
So I want to go back to the 19th century as well. I brought a book with me that I finished recently, and obviously on a podcast you can't see this, but it's a kind of leather-bound book with those kind of very tracing paper thin pages. It's a book that actually belonged to my mum. We lost my mum about 5 years ago now, and so I've been kind of reading through her books to kind of get a bit of feel a bit closer to her, I suppose, in some way. So this was presented to her by the Cleggs Lane Methodist Sunday School on the February the 20th, 1949. So this book's called Lavengro, and it's about a young man growing up and trying to find his place in the world. He's a very, very talented linguist, so he learns all kinds of languages, including the kind of normal languages, Italian and so on. And also his family are rather dismayed that he goes away to learn Irish, which they feel is rather beneath him. He also spends quite a lot of time with the Romani communities where he lives, and that's where the name of the book comes from. So Lavengro, engro, the word engro is Romani for a master. So they called him Lavengro, which means word master, because he was so skilled in all these languages. One of the other Romani characters in the book is called Petulengro, which means a blacksmith master, which is obviously quite an important role in that community. And it's a great book. It's like 100 chapters, but they're all very short, so it's lovely to kind of pick up and put down during the course of a day. And it just shows you a few things that are really different about the world we live in today and the world they lived in then. It makes you realise how far we've come away from things like dog fights. There's quite a lot of things like dog fights in there.
Wow.
And like boxing matches, but just between two ordinary people who challenge each other. And
bare knuckle boxing.
Bare knuckle boxing, yeah. At the fair, for example, that's what happens at the fair. So, in some ways you kind of think, oh gosh, that was a really difficult period to live in, and you kind of see that things have come on so far. There's also just some really lovely little pen portraits in there, describing people who are quite exotic characters often, and it's just I really, really, really enjoyed it. It's kind of a bit frustrating in that it seems to kind of end almost in the middle of a story. So to understand it, I do now have to find the sequel, which is called Romani Rye, and read that. But if anybody's looking for a 19th century book, so written in the mid-1800s, I would definitely recommend this. One thing I found was really interesting was that at one point he's in Edinburgh and he's talking about the new town and the old town. So Edinburgh New Town is clearly not as new as I'd imagined it to be. But certainly I would recommend anybody who likes a nice bit of fiction and likes short chapters, this is a great book to pick up.
And how many languages does he speak?
About 8.
Okay, wow.
Yes.
And Shaun, you speak multiple languages, don't you?
Oh, well, I have a dabble, a few.
What do you dabble in?
What do I dabble in? Russian's probably my least worst one. bit of French, bit of Spanish, bit of German, smattering of Czech.
Wow.
Italian.
Okay. You dabble in all of these languages. So I've suggested a Bollywood film about tax and cricket that's right up Hilary Street, and she suggested a book about a linguist. So I think that might appeal to you.
Oh, yes. Who was the author, Hilary? I didn't catch it.
Sorry, I maybe didn't say. It's George Borrow. B-R-O-O-W. George Borrow.
Right, yeah. I shall give him a Google.
And we'll put links to these things that we've suggested in the description.
Great. So that brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Please do follow us, recommend us to others, give us a rating. If you want to get in touch, our email addresses are in the show notes. And we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for listening.